I've been a food delivery driver for over a year now, and I've witnessed a fair share of oddities, but nothing came close to what happened that night. It was an unusually quiet Friday. Orders were sparse, and I was about to call it a night when I received a request to deliver to a townhouse on a street I didn't recognize. The neighborhood appeared calm at first glance, almost too calm, but the address seemed simple enough. The house was in the middle of the street, and the order, just a snack and a drink, was unremarkable. What unsettled me was the note that accompanied it. Knock on the gate. Wait for instructions. There was something off about the way it was phrased, something that tugged at the edges of my nerves, but I couldn't quite place why. When I arrived, the street was eerily quiet. The townhouse itself was old, its faded brick walls almost blending into the shadows of the night. The small garden out front was meticulously kept, too perfect, as if someone were trying to hide something beneath its pristine surface. I honked my horn, and almost immediately a woman appeared at the gate. Her movements were jerky, as though she was waiting for something to happen. She was thin, with messy hair tied back, her skin pale under the dim streetlight. There was a nervous energy around her, something that set my teeth on edge. Her gaze flickered over me, then quickly darted away as she said, "Come in and leave it in the kitchen." Her voice was high, strained. I stood frozen. "I'm sorry, I can't do that. I only deliver to the door," I told her. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she fixed her eyes on me. There was a flicker of something dangerous in them, something that made my stomach drop. Then, without a word, she slammed the gate shut, leaving the bag untouched on the ground. Her retreat was swift, almost frantic, as if she had expected me to comply without question. I was about to just drop the bag and leave when something else caught my attention. Across the street, a car sat idling, its engine off. The headlights were dim, but the driver's face was clearly visible. His eyes, those dead eyes, were fixed on me. Not in a casual way, like a neighbor, but in a way that made my skin crawl, as if he were waiting for me to make a move. I felt my pulse quicken. I pulled out my phone to message support, but before I could type anything, I heard footsteps. They were too quick, too loud to be casual. My gut told me it was time to go. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my helmet, started my bike, and just as I revved the engine, the man from the car stepped out. He was large, his black jacket swallowing the faint light from the street lamp. His face was blank, but the way his eyes narrowed at me, it felt like something primal, like a threat that I couldn't yet fully comprehend. Without a word, he started toward me, shouting something I couldn't quite make out, his voice low and menacing. I tried to pull away, but before I could even roll the throttle, he was at my bike, slamming his hands against the hood. "Go back and complete the delivery," he screamed, his voice breaking with anger. His words hit me like a cold wave. I didn't know if he was armed or if he was just unstable, but I could feel the danger in his presence. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the sweat pricking at my skin. He pounded harder, his fists leaving dents in the metal. My mind raced. There was no time to think. There was only instinct. I shoved the throttle forward, hearing the screech of my tires as I sped away, the sickening sound of his fist against my rearview mirror chasing me down the street. I glanced in my rear view as I sped down the road. The man was standing in the middle of the street, His eyes locked on me, unwavering, like he knew I'd come back. But I wasn't coming back. My heart was pounding in my throat, my hands slick on the handlebars. I pushed the bike faster, harder, until the world around me blurred. I found a gas station a few blocks later. I pulled in, breathing hard, trying to steady my racing thoughts. I called the app's support, but the attendant just sounded confused. "Contact the police," he said, his voice distant, mechanical. "Get a protocol number just in case." I hesitated, but I knew. I had to. I dialed 190, my fingers shaking as I pressed the numbers, a cold sweat pooling beneath my clothes. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I tried to explain everything to the dispatcher without sounding paranoid, but my voice betrayed me. It trembled, cracking on certain words. They told me to meet them at the address so they could investigate. I didn't want to go back there, but what choice did I have? I drove slowly, the weight in my stomach growing heavier with each block. When I arrived, I found the squad car already parked in front of the house. I gave my account again, this time to the officers, repeating the strange behavior of the woman at the gate, the unsettling man in the car. They listened, exchanged glances, then decided to investigate. One officer stayed with me, his eyes scanning the surroundings like a hawk, while the other hopped the gate. No one answered the doorbell. I stood there, my thoughts swirling, trying to make sense of the silence that seemed to swallow the street whole. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The officer who had entered the house vanished from sight, leaving the one by my side in taut silence. He was alert, stiff, but his posture made me uneasy. I looked around, trying to ground myself in something familiar, but the neighborhood, which had felt so still before, now seemed to exhale an emptiness that pressed against me. The car I had seen earlier was gone, leaving no trace of its presence. Then, without warning, the officer who had gone inside came rushing out. He looked pale, his face tight with tension, and he spoke urgently into his radio, his eyes not meeting mine. Then, almost as if testing me, he asked, "Are you sure it was here?" I nodded, pointing toward the house. "It was exactly here," I said, my voice growing tighter with every passing second. But the officer didn't seem convinced. He exchanged another glance with his partner, who had started speaking in low, hushed tones. My heart hammered in my chest. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice strained. The officer hesitated, then muttered, "The house is empty. It looks like no one's been here for years." I was stunned, my stomach dropping. "But there was someone here," I protested, my voice cracking. "The woman at the gate, the man in the car. They were right there." He shook his head slowly, as if my words didn't make sense, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. One of the officers pulled out a flashlight, his eyes narrowing. "Stay here. We're checking the house again." He motioned for his partner, and they disappeared around the back. I stood alone, the chill of the night settling deep into my bones, my skin prickling with unease. The wind was biting, but it wasn't the cold that made my skin crawl. I started pacing, trying to make sense of everything. The woman's desperate eyes, the man's unblinking stare, the forceful way he'd pounded on my bike, it all felt so real, so undeniable. And yet, now the house stood before me, untouched, as if everything had been a cruel mirage. My gaze fell to the mailbox, and I froze. It was crammed full, Old newspapers, unpaid bills, yellowing pamphlets. The kind of clutter you'd expect to see in a house abandoned for months, maybe years. Why would someone let their mail pile up like that if they were still living here? It didn't make sense. A creeping terror gripped my chest. My gut told me to leave, to turn and run, but I couldn't. The officers were still inside, and something told me they weren't telling me everything. The silence stretched on. I felt like I was caught in some kind of limbo. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. One of them looked confused, but the other was studying me closely. His eyes narrowed. "There's nothing in there," he said flatly. "No furniture, no signs of life. The house is completely empty." My head spun. I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. I pointed to the house again, my voice desperate. "There was someone here," I insisted. "I saw them." The officer looked at his partner, and something passed between them, something I didn't understand. He asked, almost too casually, "Are you sure about the address?" I pulled out the app and showed him the details. The house number, the street. Everything matched perfectly. The officer exchanged a glance with the other and muttered something that sent a chill through me. "We've had a call about this address before. Months ago. Same story. People saw someone at the house, but when we got here, there was no one." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean, same story?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The officers exchanged another uncomfortable look. "Probably just a prank," one of them said, his tone flat, almost dismissive. But the way he said it, like he was trying to end the conversation before it could go any deeper, made my stomach twist. I looked at the house again, my thoughts a blur. The porch light was off. The window, where I had seen the woman, was now closed and coated in dust. Nothing about it made sense. I felt like an idiot. What if this was all just some bizarre prank? But even as the thought crossed my mind, I couldn't shake the memory of the man in the car, his eyes never leaving me. And the woman at the gate, her desperate, pleading gaze. It wasn't a prank. It was something else. And I was standing in the middle of it, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape from. One of the officers suggested I file a formal police report the next day if I wanted to officially document the case in the app. They said they'd keep an eye on the address, but for now, there was nothing more to be done. I didn't argue. I climbed onto my bike, that heavy knot still lodged in my stomach, that sickening feeling of wrongness clawing at me. When I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something, or someone, moving in the upstairs window. It was so brief, so fleeting, that I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks, trying to make sense of the chaos of the night. But I couldn't shake it. I didn't stop to check. I revved the engine hard, the roar of the bike drowning out the creeping anxiety that followed me as I sped away, leaving that cursed street behind. But no matter how fast I went, I couldn't outrun the thoughts that clung to me in the days that followed. I couldn't stop thinking about that house, that street, the way the air around it felt. Wrong. The officers had told me to report it, so I went to the station the next day to do just that. While waiting in line, I opened the app, intending to pull up the details of the order. But that's when things took a darker turn. The order had vanished. It wasn't in my delivery record anymore. It was like it had never existed. That sinking feeling in my gut deepened. I tried to explain this to the officer who helped me, but he brushed it off, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Could be a system glitch," he said flatly, offering no more comfort than a pat on the back. His dismissiveness only made the hairs on my neck stand on end. It didn't feel like a glitch. It felt like something was deliberately erasing the trace of that night, like it was being erased from reality itself. To this day, I avoid driving down that street. I can't shake the feeling that there's something unfinished, something waiting. Sometimes I've wondered if I should go back, just to see if the house is still there, if anything has changed. But then I stop myself. I don't want to know. I don't want to see it, to risk that feeling again. When I tell this story to others, they look at me like I'm crazy, like I've spun some elaborate tale. I wish I could believe them. Maybe I'd think the same if I hadn't felt the suffocating fear that night, the way my skin crawled with a presence I couldn't explain. But what haunts me most is the thought that this isn't over. That maybe, one night, another delivery driver will get an order for that same address. And maybe, just maybe, he won't be so lucky. Maybe he'll become part of whatever's waiting in that house. And that, more than anything, terrifies me. I never thought that delivering a pizza could become the most terrifying moment of my life. I've been working as a delivery driver for 3 years, and I've seen my share of strange situations: drunk customers, empty houses, orders no one answers, and awkward exchanges. But none of that prepared me for what happened that night. It was a quiet Tuesday, almost at the end of my shift, when I received the last order: a large pepperoni pizza to a house in a remote neighborhood, one of those places where the streets are poorly lit, and the houses are spaced far apart like forgotten relics. I didn't think much of it. All I wanted was to finish my shift and go home. I shoved the pizza into my thermal bag, hopped on my bike, and headed out. When I arrived, the house already felt wrong. It loomed in the darkness, huge, with a tall wall and a rusted iron gate that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There wasn't a single light on. I stood there for a few seconds, straining my eyes, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. I rang the doorbell, and the sound echoed through the still night air, amplifying the silence that followed. I waited and waited. Then suddenly, a light flickered on in an upstairs window, and a silhouette appeared, watching me. I froze. The figure stared for what seemed like an eternity before vanishing just as quickly. I told myself it was probably the customer, getting ready or something. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When the gate finally creaked open, a large man stepped out, middle-aged, his face shadowed by the dim light. His gaze pierced through me like a blade. He didn't say, "Good evening," or "Thanks for the delivery," or anything polite. He simply asked, with a tone so blunt it felt like a slap, "Are you the delivery guy?" I felt a chill run down my spine, but I nodded, holding up the thermal bag to show him the pizza. But instead of relief, his eyes darkened and he stepped forward. His breath reeked of alcohol. I could feel his gaze on me like a weight. "Are you really the delivery guy, or are you him?" His words were thick, almost slurred, but the question was sharp. Him? My mind raced. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the discomfort in my chest started to swell. I tried to stay calm, explaining that I was just there to deliver the pizza. I even showed him the receipt on my phone, but it didn't seem to matter. He didn't blink, didn't back off. Instead, he smiled, a slow, twisted grin that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the smile of someone who thought something was funny. No, it was more like a threat. You think I'm an idiot, don't you? His voice dropped to a low growl. Before I could respond, he reached under his shirt and pulled out a gun. My heart stopped. The world around me tilted. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The revolver was pointed straight at my face. You're the lover of my wife, aren't you? He spat. Say it. My mouth went dry, and the words caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. He started pacing around me, the gun held loosely in his hand, but I could see the tension in his grip. It was unstable, like he might lose control at any second. My legs were shaking, my mind a blur of panic. I don't know who your wife is, I tried to say, but he cut me off, shouting, Stop lying. I know it's you. His voice was shaking with rage. I was trapped. I had only come here to deliver a pizza, and now I was standing in front of a man who seemed completely unhinged, holding a gun like he was ready to pull the trigger at any moment. Every second felt like an eternity, and I could feel my breath getting shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, as if things weren't already spiraling fast enough, he barked an order. Get inside. My mind raced. I knew I couldn't run. If I tried, he would shoot. So I did what he told me, stepping cautiously into the dark, silent house. Inside, it was worse than I could have imagined. The house was a chaotic mess. Furniture overturned, empty bottles scattered across the floor, and strange marks that looked like dried blood near the stairs. The dim hallway light barely illuminated enough to reveal how wrong everything was. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been opened in days. The man shoved me into the middle of the room and began shouting toward the upstairs. Come down now. Look who I caught. Your lover's down here. His voice was filled with a manic energy, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if he was talking to me or someone else. I didn't know if this was some kind of paranoid delusion or if there was someone else in the house. My head was spinning. All I knew was that I needed to find a way out before he did something worse. While he was shouting, I heard footsteps coming from upstairs. They weren't hurried, frantic, or panicked like someone running away. They were slow, heavy, almost dragging, like each step was a struggle. I could only stand there, staring at the stairs, heart pounding in my chest. The air around me felt thick, like it was suffocating me. I couldn't tell if hearing someone approaching was a good sign or if it was about to make everything worse. Then a woman appeared, moving hesitantly down the stairs. Her face was ashen, her eyes swollen from crying, and she looked like she was in shock. She couldn't even look at the man. She kept her head down, avoiding his gaze, but it didn't stop him from directing his fury at her. Is this what you do when I'm not here, huh? He spat, his voice raw with anger. You invite him over to my house? She didn't answer right away. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, trembling as she spoke. I don't know what you're talking about. The man laughed, this low, guttural laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the laugh of someone who thought something was funny. It was the laugh of a man on the edge, a man who had lost touch with reason. He pointed the gun at me again, and my stomach dropped. He says he doesn't know. You say you don't know. So why is he here? In that moment, I didn't know what was scarier, the man's insanity, the gun, or the terrified look on her face. But then I noticed something that made everything click. She was holding her phone, partially hidden behind her skirt, but I could see the screen, just enough to make out the open delivery app. The tracking was still on the screen. The pizza wasn't for him. It was for her. And then it hit me. This wasn't an order. This was a cry for help. She had used the pizza delivery to get someone to her, me, to hopefully bring help, to show someone that she wasn't the one in control here. That realization hit me like a cold wave, and in that moment, I knew that anything I said could push him over the edge. The man was getting more erratic now. He paced back and forth, his eyes flicking between me and the woman, his hand never leaving the gun, pointing it at me one moment and yelling at her the next. I stood there, frozen, not knowing if any wrong word or movement would set him off. His words were growing more and more paranoid, accusing her of everything, his mind spiraling. Every second felt like an eternity, and I couldn't help but feel like this man, this wild animal, was about to pull the trigger without a second thought. Meanwhile, she stood still at the top of the stairs, her body taut with fear but unmoving, like she was trying to measure every word before speaking. Her eyes flickered to me for a split second, but it was a glance full of meaning. Help me. There was nothing I could do but maintain my calm. I kept my posture steady, my voice low. I only deliver pizzas. That's it, I swear. You made the order through the app, didn't you? At that question, his expression darkened. His eyes locked onto mine with such intensity that it felt like I was being suffocated by his gaze. So you know it was her who ordered, right? He demanded. See? This is what you two are planning, huh? His hand tightened on the gun. Time seemed to slow. My heart raced, my breath shallow. I could feel the sweat gathering at the back of my neck, but I couldn't move. Then, to my surprise, she took a step forward, still holding the phone in her hand. Her voice was calm, but there was something in it, something firm, something defiant. That's right. I was the one who ordered. The words hung in the air like a dare. And what are you going to do now? Kill him because of a pizza? Her courage was almost too much for me to process. In the face of this maniac, she stepped forward, challenging him, standing her ground. And for a moment, it seemed to have an effect on him. He stopped pacing. His body seemed to freeze, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. But for how long, I had no idea. The silence that followed felt like a bomb ticking down. He stared at her, eyes wide, like he didn't know what to make of her response. I held my breath, praying it would diffuse the situation, but fearing it might make it worse. Then he laughed again, this strange, hollow laugh that made my blood run cold. He lowered the gun for a split second, just 1 second. But even that brief moment felt like an eternity. His hands trembled. Was it fear? Or was it rage? Either way, the gun never left his grip. The chaos was far from over. The silence thickened in the room, suffocating as the man stood there, his gun still clutched tightly in his hand. But it seemed as though some of his aggression had drained away. He glanced at the woman, then at me, then back at the space around him. his face twisted in confusion, as if he was trying to convince himself that he hadn't lost control. "You think this is all a game, huh?" he muttered, almost to himself, his voice raw and broken. "That everything's going to be fine?" I didn't know if he was reflecting on his actions or if the grip on his sanity was slipping even further, but I knew I had to stay still, keep my composure. One wrong move, and it would all fall apart. The woman, still unnervingly calm, locked eyes with him. "I just wanted you to stop," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that clung to her words. "To see what you're doing. Look at us. There's no turning back now. This is going to end us no matter what." Her words felt like a surrender, but there was something in her tone, a flicker of hope maybe, that she could calm him, make him understand. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. And then, as if the trance had broken, he lowered the gun, but didn't put it away. He just stood there, staring into space. His movements were slow, almost absent, like he didn't quite know where he was anymore. I froze, unsure of what to do next. The woman looked at me one last time, and for a fleeting second, it felt like she was trying to communicate something, some unspoken plea. She wasn't just asking for help to escape. She was asking me to do something, to make a decision, because maybe I was the only one who could help her without anyone else getting hurt. The weight of that realization hit me like a physical blow. I was paralyzed, my mind a jumbled mess. Any wrong move, any word, and everything could explode again. Then, the man turned his back on us, walking slowly across the room, as if he were just wandering, as lost as I felt. The woman didn't move, but her gaze never left me. It was a silent plea, one that seemed to echo louder than the gunshots that had filled the room earlier. The silence was deafening. My heartbeat was the loudest sound in the room. I wanted to help, but what could I do? I wasn't trained for this. I wasn't the police. I was just a guy delivering pizza. And now I was part of something far darker than I ever imagined. All I had was a thermal bag with a pizza inside and a life that depended on the decision I was about to make. Then suddenly, he stopped walking. His gaze fell on the woman's phone, and for a split second, it seemed like he had a moment of clarity. He shoved the gun away with a jerky motion, as though he'd realized just how far out of control he'd gotten. He looked at the woman, his voice quieter this time, but still filled with suspicion. "You did this because of him, didn't you?" She didn't answer right away, but the look in her eyes told me everything. The pizza wasn't just an order. It was a desperate cry for help, a way for her to bring someone, anyone, into her nightmare. The realization hit me hard. I was part of that plan. I was the hope she had left, and at that moment, I realized that I might have been the only one who could help her. He stood still, staring at her, as the tension stretched out like a taut wire. I could feel the air thick with fear. My mind screamed, wondering if this was the moment he would snap again. I held my breath, praying that whatever happened next wouldn't be worse than what had already transpired. And then, just like that, he started walking toward the front door. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though the rage had drained from him. He seemed to be trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman's eyes flicked toward me, and in that moment, I could see it, the strange mix of relief and lingering fear. She was free from the immediate threat, but the question remained, What happens next? I felt like a spectator in a nightmare that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the chaos around me. As he reached the door, he turned back toward me. His eyes were no longer wild, no longer paranoid. Instead, there was emptiness there, a hollow gaze that made my skin crawl. "Get out," he said, his voice flat, "before I regret it." I didn't need any more encouragement. I knew this was my moment to leave. Without another word, I turned and ran for the door, every muscle in my body screaming to get away. I didn't look back. My motorcycle was parked outside, and within seconds, I was on it, the engine roaring to life, the tires screeching as I sped away from that house, away from that nightmare. As I drove through the dark night, my body was still in shock, my hands trembling on the handlebars. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, but the fear, it wouldn't leave. Each turn, each passing streetlight, felt like it was pressing down harder on me. The whole experience was so surreal, so impossible, that with every mile I covered, I began to wonder if it had really happened. Had I really been part of something so horrible, something so unexpected, or was it all a twisted dream? One thing was for sure. The fear would stay with me. The terror would cling to me, and no matter how far I ran, I would never look at a pizza delivery the same way again. The silence thickened in the room, suffocating, as the man stood there, his gun still clutched tightly in his hand, but it seemed as though some of his aggression had drained away. He glanced at the woman, then at me, then back at the space around him. His face twisted in confusion, as if he was trying to convince himself that he hadn't lost control. "You think this is all a game, huh?" he muttered, almost to himself, his voice raw and broken. "That everything's going to be fine?" I didn't know if he was reflecting on his actions, or if the grip on his sanity was slipping even further. But I knew I had to stay still, keep my composure. One wrong move, and it would all fall apart. The woman, still unnervingly calm, locked eyes with him. "I just wanted you to stop," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that clung to her words. "To see what you're doing. Look at us. There's no turning back now. This is going to end us, no matter what." Her words felt like a surrender, but there was something in her tone, a flicker of hope maybe, that she could calm him, make him understand. For a moment, everything seemed to pause, and then, as if the trance had broken, he lowered the gun, but didn't put it away. He just stood there, staring into space. His movements were slow, almost absent, like he didn't quite know where he was anymore. I froze, unsure of what to do next. The woman looked at me one last time, and for a fleeting second, it felt like she was trying to communicate something, some unspoken plea. She wasn't just asking for help to escape. She was asking me to do something, to make a decision, because maybe I was the only one who could help her without anyone else getting hurt. The weight of that realization hit me like a physical blow. I was paralyzed, my mind a jumbled mess. Any wrong move, any word, and everything could explode again. Then, the man turned his back on us, walking slowly across the room, as if he were just wandering, as lost as I felt. The woman didn't move, but her gaze never left me. It was a silent plea, one that seemed to echo louder than the gunshots that had filled the room earlier. The silence was deafening. My heartbeat was the loudest sound in the room. I wanted to help, But what could I do? I wasn't trained for this. I wasn't the police. I was just a guy delivering pizza, and now I was part of something far darker than I ever imagined. All I had was a thermal bag with a pizza inside and a life that depended on the decision I was about to make. Then suddenly, he stopped walking. His gaze fell on the woman's phone, and for a split second, it seemed like he had a moment of clarity. He shoved the gun away with a jerky motion, as though he'd realized just how far out of control he'd gotten. He looked at the woman, his voice quieter this time, but still filled with suspicion. "You did this because of him, didn't you?" She didn't answer right away, but the look in her eyes told me everything. The pizza wasn't just an order. It was a desperate cry for help, a way for her to bring someone, anyone, into her nightmare. The realization hit me hard. I was part of that plan. I was the hope she had left, and at that moment, I realized that I might have been the only one who could help her. He stood still, staring at her, as the tension stretched out like a taut wire. I could feel the air thick with fear. My mind screamed, wondering if this was the moment he would snap again. I held my breath, praying that whatever happened next wouldn't be worse than what had already transpired. And then, just like that, he started walking toward the front door. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though the rage had drained from him. He seemed to be trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman's eyes flicked toward me, and in that moment, I could see it. The strange mix of relief and lingering fear. She was free from the immediate threat, but the question remained, what happens next? I felt like a spectator in a nightmare that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with the chaos around me. As he reached the door, he turned back toward me. His eyes were no longer wild, no longer paranoid. Instead, there was emptiness there, a hollow gaze that made my skin crawl. "Get out," he said, his voice flat, "before I regret it." I didn't need any more encouragement. I knew this was my moment to leave. Without another word, I turned and ran for the door, every muscle in my body screaming to get away. I didn't look back. My motorcycle was parked outside, and within seconds, I was on it. The engine roaring to life, the tires screeching as I sped away from that house, away from that nightmare. As I drove through the dark night, my body was still in shock, my hands trembling on the handlebars. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, but the fear, it wouldn't leave. Each turn, each passing streetlight, felt like it was pressing down harder on me. The whole experience was so surreal, so impossible, that with every mile I covered, I began to wonder if it had really happened. Had I really been part of something so horrible, something so unexpected? I never imagined a delivery could be so disturbing. I've worked as a delivery driver for a few years now, and I've seen a lot of strange things. Drunk customers, odd requests, houses that felt off, but nothing prepared me for what happened that night. It started as a simple order, a pepperoni pizza for a house in a quiet neighborhood. I arrived without any problems, but the moment I stepped up to the door, something felt wrong. The man who answered the door was friendly, almost too friendly, with a smile that seemed too welcoming for the situation. He seemed eager to have me inside. "My mother's very sick," he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "She's in her room, lying down. She's very weak. Before I could ask any questions, he stepped back, motioning me in. There was something about the way he spoke that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I went to the indicated room, knocked on the door, and heard a low murmur from inside, as if the man was speaking to someone. When I entered, the air hit me like a wall, heavy, thick with the scent of air fresheners. At first, I couldn't understand what I was walking into, but then it all became clear. The room was too silent, too still. There was no sound of breathing, no movement. The curtains were drawn tight, and several air purifiers hummed incessantly, buzzing in a way that filled the room with a mechanical noise, a constant backdrop that somehow made everything feel even more off-kilter. And then I saw her. The woman in the bed, covered by a sheet, had been dead for some time. Her skin was an unnatural shade of pale, and she was stiff, her body no longer alive. The smell in the room wasn't just from an illness. It was the unmistakable odor of death, hidden behind a cloud of artificial scents. I felt a knot form in my stomach, my mind screaming to get out, to leave before anything else happened. But the man stood outside, and something about the way he spoke paralyzed me. He seemed so calm, almost normal, like he was asking me to deliver pizza to any other house. He stepped into the room with that same unsettling smile, looking at the body as if it were a normal, everyday scene. "She's very weak," he said, still smiling. "But she loves pizza. You can feed her, can't you? She'll want a slice, I'm sure." His voice was so casual, it felt like a slap in the face. This man, standing next to the lifeless body of his mother, was acting like it was any normal day. He calmly gestured to the bed, asking me to place the pizza on the table next to her. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. What shocked me the most was his behavior. He sliced the pizza with almost mechanical precision, and with the same unnerving calmness, began placing the pieces near his mother's mouth, as if she could eat. "Look, Mom," he said, with an eerie cheerfulness, "you're going to love this slice. It's fresh." I stood there, unable to do anything. He continued to talk to her like she was alive, urging her to eat, telling her the pizza was delicious. He repeated the same phrases over and over, his voice never wavering. I couldn't understand how someone could be so detached from reality, so lost in their own delusion. I started to feel a lump form in my throat, a strange mix of horror and pity. This wasn't just denial. This was a complete detachment from the truth. The man didn't seem to grasp that his mother was gone, and the worst part was that he was dragging me into his fantasy, involving me in something so twisted that I didn't know how to escape. He looked at me, still smiling, that same empty smile, and asked, "Could you help put a piece in her mouth? She loves to eat like this, with someone's help." I didn't know what to say. My legs felt like lead, my mind racing in a blur. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped in this moment, unable to break free. Everything felt so surreal, so dreamlike, that for a second, I wondered if I was imagining it. But no, this was real. The woman was there, cold and motionless in the bed, and the man beside her, so calm, so unaware of what had really happened, still acting as though she were alive. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, to stop this, but the words wouldn't come. That's when he looked at me again, without losing his composure. She asked me to bring pizza today, he said, his voice soft now, as though explaining something simple. I made everything for her, but she's so tired. He bent down and adjusted the sheet around her, almost tenderly, as if he were taking care of a child or preparing her for a meal. Each of his words felt more detached from reality than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was completely lost. He was submerged in his own fantasy, and I, frozen in that room, was being pulled deeper into it. I couldn't interrupt him, couldn't make him see the truth. I was powerless, trapped in a moment that I had no way of escaping. It was at that moment that the shock fully took over me. I knew I couldn't stay there, that everything unfolding before me was beyond my comprehension. But my mind couldn't seem to accept the truth. The feeling of invading something so personal, so intimate, left me frozen, unable to move. Every part of me screamed to run, but I didn't know how to interrupt without causing even more harm. The man, so unnervingly calm, looked at me one last time, his smile still in place, and gestured for me to approach. "Help her, please," he said, his voice too gentle, too persuasive. "She'll feel better if she eats a piece." Those words cut through me like a knife, their absurdity sinking deep into my bones. I felt like I was being dragged into a nightmare, and with every passing second, I was losing my grip on what was real. How could I be part of this? How could I help in something so horribly wrong? But there I was, standing still, paralyzed by the scene unfolding in front of me, trying to ignore the growing sense of desperation gnawing at my insides. I took a step toward the bed. The man handed me a slice of pizza, and with a more forced smile, asked me to feed his mother. I placed the slice near her mouth, my hand trembling. She remained lifeless. Her skin was cold and stiff, her eyes closed in eternal stillness. The smell emanating from her was thick and suffocating, not the scent of illness, but the heavy, unmistakable scent of death, trying to be masked by the overwhelming scent of air fresheners. It was a stench I couldn't escape, no matter how much I willed it away. The man, still wearing that calm expression, began to speak again as if I weren't standing there, witnessing the horror of it all. He spoke about how much his mother loved pizza, about how happy she would be with this simple treat. He described the joy she found in the smallest things, the way a slice of pizza could make her smile. But each word that came out of his mouth made me feel more sick, more trapped in his delusion. He wasn't just denying the truth. He was immersed in a world of fantasy. "She always asked me to bring pizza when she was feeling bad," he said, his voice soft, as if recounting a fond memory. "She said it made her feel better." I could feel the weight of his grief in every word, but it only made the situation worse. It was clear to me now. He had completely disconnected from reality. He couldn't see the truth. The woman lying in front of me wasn't just sick. She was dead. And he was so deeply lost in his need to preserve the image of her, to keep her alive in some small way, that he couldn't see the devastation around him. I wanted to scream, to say anything to make him realize, but I was completely speechless. I looked at the woman in the bed one last time, my stomach churning as the full weight of the situation settled in. I couldn't understand what had happened here. How had he come to believe this? The man, unaware of how much farther he was sinking into madness, asked again for my help, his voice filled with that same unnerving calm. "Could you help me feed her? She loves it when someone helps her like this." I was trapped, caught between the fear of leaving and the growing horror of staying. I didn't know what would happen if I told him I couldn't help, but every instinct screamed at me to leave. The man's need to keep this delusion alive was palpable, and I felt suffocated by it. I wanted to escape, to break free from the twisted world he'd pulled me into, but every second that passed felt like another step toward insanity. Time dragged on. It was as though I had been standing there for hours, unable to move, unable to make the right choice. The man's words became a steady stream, each one more detached from reality than the last, as he continued to talk about how much his mother had loved these small moments. I was lost in a sea of confusion, my own fear and empathy pushing me deeper into a state of paralysis. How could I interrupt? How could I make him see what was real when he couldn't? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood up and looked at me, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "Thank you for helping," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "She'll feel much better now." His words were coated with a strange emptiness, an emptiness that I couldn't escape. I was still in shock, unable to find the words to match the horror I had just witnessed. I nodded, something nonsensical falling out of my mouth, but it didn't matter. I had to leave. I needed to get out of there, to escape the suffocating weight of that room, but I couldn't move. It was as if my body was locked in place, unable to break free from this nightmare. The man continued to speak, his voice monotonous, but I couldn't focus on his words anymore. When he finally turned away to adjust something on the shelf, I saw my chance. I turned slowly, quietly, and left the room, my steps barely making a sound. Each one felt like an attempt to distance myself from something I could never forget. I walked out of the house, my body still trembling, and as soon as I was outside, I could breathe again. But the terror didn't leave me. It stayed with me, thick in my chest, as I climbed onto my motorcycle and rode away. The world around me felt distant, like I had just woken up from a nightmare I couldn't shake off. The scene in that room haunted me, and I knew that I would never forget what I had witnessed, trapped in a man's delusion, unwilling to face the unbearable truth. I left the house with my heart still pounding, the weight of what I had just witnessed pressing down on me. The moment I stepped into the car and started the engine, the silence inside me was deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just walked out of a nightmare, a waking dream where everything was out of place. The world felt distorted, like I had crossed a threshold into something I could never fully understand. I couldn't even begin to fathom what I had just witnessed. It wasn't just a pizza delivery. It was something darker, something I couldn't wrap my mind around. The more I replayed it in my head, the more questions piled up. How could that man not see what was in front of him? His mother was dead, her body cold and lifeless, but he continued to feed her, talking to her as if she were still alive. Grief does strange things to the mind. I knew that much. But what I witnessed that night went beyond anything I had imagined. How could a person sink so deep into denial, so far from reality, that they could create a world where the dead were still alive? As I drove, the quiet hum of the engine was drowned out by the storm of thoughts in my head. I wanted to forget everything I had seen, to erase the memory of that woman, of that man's desperate delusion. But something inside me knew that memory would follow me for a long time. I could feel the images burning into my mind, searing into my consciousness. The more I tried to push them away, the clearer they became. The stillness of the woman in the bed, the hollow, empty smile of the man as he sliced the pizza, the cold weight of reality I couldn't escape. To this day, I wonder what happened to that man, to his mother. Did he ever come to terms with the truth? Did he ever realize that she was gone, that he had been feeding her lifeless body as though she could still enjoy the pizza she once loved? That night, I saw something more than just a grieving son. I saw a mind so shattered by loss that it built a fantasy around it, something I still don't fully understand. Every time I close my eyes, I remember that scene. The woman's body, frozen in time, and the man's quiet insistence that she was simply too tired to eat on her own. It was an image that will never leave me. It's a memory that has haunted me, and no matter how hard I try, I can't erase it from my mind. That night, I learned how fragile the human mind can be when it confronts the weight of loss. How a person, in their pain, can weave an alternate reality to shield themselves from the unbearable truth. And the worst part? I'll never look at a pizza delivery the same way again. It was supposed to be just another typical delivery night. Another pizza to drop off, a quick exchange, and then back home. But as soon as I received the order, something tugged at my gut, a feeling I couldn't quite explain. The address was in a secluded area, a large, isolated mansion surrounded by a meticulously kept garden, the kind of place you only see in movies. I arrived, and the first thing that struck me was the silence. There was no movement, no lights flickering in neighboring homes. Only the mansion stood there, illuminated, its windows glowing in the dark like eyes in the distance, watching. I knocked on the door, and within seconds, it opened. The man who answered was polite, too polite, with a smile that seemed a little too eager. "Did you bring the pizza?" "I'm starving," he said, his voice cheerful, almost too cheerful, as he invited me inside. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt a shift in the air. The house was colder than it should have been, with a vast entrance hall that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. The stairs loomed tall, their wood creaking under the slightest movement. The walls were lined with old paintings, the kind you'd find in dusty antique shops, each one depicting scenes of hunts or stormy, barren landscapes. The smell of wood lingered, but there was something else, something indefinable that clawed at my senses. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the old house, but the discomfort inside me only grew. Tomas, the man who had greeted me, introduced himself with a casual air. But soon after, something about his posture, his movements, began to make me uneasy. He was still too polite, too careful with his words, as if every sentence was calculated. "Make yourself at home," he insisted, his smile now slightly strained, and the look in his eyes made me feel like something wasn't right. As we moved through the house, Tomas began talking about how much he enjoyed living there alone, how the solitude helped him relax and escape. The more he spoke, the more I started to notice the oddness in his behavior. His tone was too exaggerated, too insistent, like he was trying to convince me of something I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The walls seemed to close in on me as we walked, and my nerves kept telling me to leave. But I stayed, unsure if I was overreacting. When we reached the living room, the space was elegant, but there was something off about it. The black leather sofas and large rugs felt too imposing, and the paintings, those grim scenes of hunts and barren landscapes, seemed to stare back at me. The air was thick with the smell of heavy incense, mingling with the stale air, making everything feel heavier, as if the house itself was trying to hide something. Tomas, noticing my gaze, nervously laughed and began explaining the meaning behind each artwork, telling me how deeply connected he felt to them. But as he spoke, I couldn't stop noticing his eyes. They were restless, darting around, never settling on anything for too long, always watching me. As he came closer, I instinctively took a small step back, but before I could react, his hand landed firmly on my shoulder. It was stronger than I expected, and for a moment, I froze. "Are you sure you don't want a drink?" "I insist," he said, his smile now tight, almost forced. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I stood there, unsure if I was being paranoid or if something was truly wrong. I tried to move away, apologizing and saying I needed to leave, but Tomas's smile didn't fade. Instead, there was something darker in his voice now, a barely perceptible edge to his words. "You're not in a hurry, are you?" "I'm great at talking. You'll see." "You won't want to leave so soon," he said, his grin widening unnervingly. I grabbed the pizza from my bag, feeling my hands shake, trying to stay calm. When I reached for the change, I noticed Tomas had stepped away, but only for a moment before he returned, and this time, his presence seemed more suffocating. The silence around us had thickened, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the empty house like a warning. That's when he leaned in, lowering his voice, and asked, "Have you never wondered what things are really like in places like this? How what you see is just a facade?" He stepped closer, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. His words were so calm, so meticulously spoken, that I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something I didn't understand. I tried to laugh it off, saying I was just there to deliver the pizza, but he didn't seem to take me seriously. "I understand," he said, his voice soft now. "Sometimes people prefer not to know. But did you know the truth can be much more interesting than the comfortable lie?" His words hung in the air, like a whisper in a dark room. It was then that the weight of the situation settled on me, pressing down like a suffocating fog. Fear coiled in my stomach, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I was no longer sure what was real, or if I was being drawn into some kind of trap. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct telling me to get out, but I was rooted in place. Tomas's gaze held mine, the smile never faltering, but there was something predatory in it now, something that told me I had wandered far beyond the comfort of simple politeness and into a deeper, darker place where I didn't belong. I could feel the sweat starting to form on the back of my neck, my body tensing in a way I couldn't control. My muscles felt like they were locked in place, and panic was crawling up my spine. I needed to leave, but the thought of making a sudden move, of running out of that house, terrified me even more. I knew any reaction could escalate things. Tomas stood there, his gaze fixed on me, watching with an unsettling intensity, and his words started to make too much sense. He spoke as if he were trying to pull me into a narrative, a twisted story that I didn't want to believe, but somehow It felt real, too real. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. Look, I really need to go. I have more deliveries to make, I said, forcing the words out. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It was tight, almost cruel, and it sent a shiver down my spine. You know you won't leave like this, don't you? He said, his voice calm, almost condescending. Nothing happens without a reason, and you've just entered something you won't easily get out of. His words struck me like a heavy blow, a wave of cold rushing through my chest. I took a few steps toward the door, but something in the air made me hesitate. It wasn't just Tomas's presence. It felt as if the house itself was watching me, as if the walls were closing in. The silence was suffocating, and the weight of it pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. My legs felt unsteady, my feet barely moving, as if something invisible was anchoring me to the spot. Fear had completely taken over. The man, who had seemed so polite, so friendly, now felt like a predator. I couldn't understand what he wanted from me, but the longer I stood there, the more his behavior twisted. He was no longer just a man offering drinks. He was a threat, a force I couldn't escape. His words, his presence, were tying me down, pulling me into his web. The panic inside me surged like a tidal wave, but I knew I couldn't just run. If I did, if I made a wrong move, I could make everything worse. Tomas, still with that twisted smile, stepped closer. His voice dropped, softer now, but there was something veiled in his words that felt like blackmail. I like to talk to people who have what no one else has, he murmured, his eyes gleaming with something unspoken. What you have is something unique. I bet you've never had an experience like this in your life. My stomach turned as he closed the distance between us. Every step he took seemed to amplify the pressure in the room. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but I couldn't move, couldn't find the strength. Suddenly he turned to the window, and for a brief moment, the smile dropped from his face. A dark, thoughtful expression took over his features, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. It felt like the house itself had exhaled, the air thickening, the silence becoming more oppressive. My pulse quickened. I tried again, my voice shaking now, trying to break the tension. I need to leave now, sir. I can't stay here any longer. But when he turned back to me, his posture was rigid, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. You'll stay a little longer, he said, his tone flat, almost final. You're not going anywhere. His voice didn't rise, but it carried a firmness that made my body freeze, as if he knew exactly how much control he had over me. What terrified me the most wasn't just his words, it was the way he said them, like a predator with complete control over the situation. His confidence, his absolute certainty that I wouldn't leave, made my skin crawl. The fear now consumed me. I couldn't escape. I didn't even know if he was truly going to let me leave. Tomas, no longer a polite host, was now a figure that felt like he was manipulating every movement I made. Each word he spoke drove me further into a corner, and the oppressive air in the room seemed to tighten with each passing second. As I stepped back again, trying to inch my way toward the door, Tomas followed my every move with an unsettling calm. He watched me closely, like he could see through my every thought. Then with that same strange smile he asked, "You're afraid of me, aren't you?" The question itself was disturbing, but it was his tone, the way he asked it, that sent a chill running down my spine. I didn't answer. How could I? I knew the fear was written all over my face. Without breaking his gaze, he reached into his pants pocket, and my body went rigid. My mind raced in every direction, trying to process what was happening. But the reality of the situation felt too surreal. What was he looking for? What was coming next? He stopped beside me, then without saying anything else, pointed to the door. "You can leave," he said in a softer voice, almost as if he were granting me permission. But the words didn't bring any relief. If anything, they only deepened the weight of the situation. The air felt suffocating, the pressure mounting. I hesitated, my body tensing with every step I took toward the door. Before I could leave, his voice followed me, soft but chilling. "I think you'll be back here sooner or later. Everyone ends up coming back." His words echoed in my mind as I crossed the threshold of the door, the cold night air rushing into my lungs. I wanted to believe that I was free, that I had escaped. But his words kept replaying in my head, a dark promise I couldn't ignore. I left the house in a blur, my hands trembling uncontrollably, my heart pounding as if it might burst through my chest. The walk to the car felt like an eternity, each step heavy with dread, as though the ground beneath me could give way at any moment. When I finally got inside and slammed the door shut, I tried to breathe. The relief was brief, fleeting, and in that moment, I knew I had escaped something. But what had I really escaped from? The house, Tomas, his smiles, his strange cryptic words? None of it made sense. It all felt like it didn't belong in the world I knew. A place where the boundaries of reality were twisted, blurred. But even as I started the car and drove back, the fear never really left. It crawled beneath my skin, clinging to me like a shadow. Tomas's words echoed in my mind, louder with each passing mile. Everyone ends up coming back. I tried to convince myself he was just some weird guy trying to get inside my head, trying to make me uncomfortable for some sick reason. But deep down, something in my gut told me that wasn't all there was. The house wasn't just a house. Tomas wasn't just a man. There was something dark there, a presence far beyond what I could explain. I never went back to that house. And though time has passed, that night has never fully left me. Every time I make a delivery now, especially when I approach large, isolated houses, my mind can't help but wander. I wonder what's behind those doors, behind those windows. What secrets are hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to wander in? What's waiting for them, just like it was waiting for me? I don't know what Tomas really wanted that night. Maybe I'll never know. But the feeling of having been so close to something so wrong, something I couldn't even comprehend, still haunts me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I hear his voice in my mind, steady and predatory. "You'll come back here sooner or later." And honestly, I'm afraid that one day I'll find out exactly what he meant.